Imagine living in the lap of luxury, surrounded by wealth and power, yet completely ignoring the most basic aspects of hygiene. Royalty, the richest, most powerful people in the world, were disgustingly filthy. They ruled with grandeur, but lived in squalor. Their hygiene habits were so revolting. They would make the average person squirm in disgust. From kings and queens who thought bathing was for the common folk to those who smelled like a rotting corpse. The royal elite didn't practice the basic cleanliness most people take for granted. The unsanitary, grotesque habits of these monarchs spanned centuries, from ancient times all the way to the medieval era. These royals didn't bathe regularly, if at all, and some used rotting substances on their skin, just to hide the unbearable stench of their unwashed bodies. Imagine how those in power would rule with the blood of their subjects on their hands, while simultaneously ignoring their own revolting neglect of basic hygiene. It's sickening to think that the very same people who had the world at their feet were wallowing in their filth and disease, and it was all swept under the rug. Because, well, they were royalty. Throughout history, their lack of cleanliness often had deadly consequences. These royals lived in a cloud of disease and death, surrounded by unsanitary practices, and yet their filthy habits were often the mark of their grandeur. The wealth they amassed could never protect them from the reality that even royalty can fall victim to their own disgusting tendencies. Tonight, we dive deep into some of the most disgusting royal habits ever practiced, the gross secrets they hid beneath their crowns, and how these habits shaped royal life, sometimes with horrifying and deadly results. Many royal figures, including Queen Elizabeth, were notorious for their refusal to bathe regularly. Elizabeth, the Queen of England, was known to bathe only once a month, if at all. She relied heavily on powders and perfumes to mask her body odor, creating a facade of cleanliness. But the truth was far more disturbing. She never washed her hair, and her thick layers of makeup were meant to cover the stench that clung to her unwashed body. She was a walking health hazard. Despite her regal appearance, the Queen and her court were so accustomed to the odor of neglect that it became the norm. Then there was King Louis, the Sun King of France, who ruled an entire kingdom without ever feeling the need to bathe. He believed that water could be harmful to the skin, and that washing would make him ill. The king's hygiene was so poor that he would instead cover his body in scented oils and perfumes. His royal robes hid the filth beneath, but the stench was still there, lingering in his palace. To mask the smell, Louis and his court would heavily rely on lavish scents, covering up the true horror beneath the surface. The most revolting aspect of it all was the fact that these kings and queens would literally avoid water for fear of illness, leaving their palaces to reek of sweat, dirt, and decay. The stench was unbearable at times, but it was tolerated because of their position. It wasn't just an oversight. It was a deliberate choice, driven by the delusion that royalty could escape the reality of hygiene. Most European royals, including King George IV, were notorious for wearing wigs to cover up their lice-infested hair. These wigs were seen as a symbol of wealth and status, but the lack of cleanliness behind them was truly horrifying. Royals would often wear the same wigs for weeks on end, never bothering to properly clean them. In fact, these wigs became breeding grounds for lice and other parasites, infesting their scalps while the royals continued to parade around in public, oblivious to the filth beneath their opulent coverings. The hair underneath the wigs was often left to rot, neglected and untreated. The wigs themselves were regularly combed, but they were never washed, and the use of heavy powders only masked the stench of the infested hair. Picture this rotting hair, bugs crawling through layers of powder, and yet these royals, wrapped in the finest garments, walked proudly through their courts, as if they were truly clean. Their entire court was filled with the stench of decay, yet the luxury of their attire and status made them oblivious to the disease and dirt festering beneath the surface. This unwashed, lice-infested reality was a horrifying testament to the arrogance and neglect of royalty, living in filth while putting on an image of grandeur. Royals didn't just neglect bathing, they also completely ignored their oral hygiene. King Henry VIII, infamous for his size and indulgence, had blackened, decayed teeth, the result of a lifetime of poor dental care and an excessive sugar diet. His sweets, especially honey and sugar-laden wine, ravaged his teeth, leaving them yellowed and rotting. But worse still, he never brushed his teeth, a practice that wasn't common among royals at the time. Medieval royals didn't even have the luxury of modern toothpaste or mouthwash. Instead, they would use alcohol or vinegar to rinse their mouths, hoping the strong acidic properties might help with bad breath. Some even relied on herbs and spices, like mint or cloves, to freshen their breath, but this did little to cover the stench of decaying teeth. The most horrifying part was how royals, including King Henry, would consume sweetened wine, which only worsened their already deteriorating teeth. They would drink it constantly, savoring the sweetness, but damaging their teeth even further, all while living with rotten teeth and bad breath that would make even the bravest person gag. In some cases, to hide the damage, some royals would even have their decayed teeth pulled out and replaced with gold crowns, trying to mask the ugliness of their dental nightmare. This only served to deepen the facade of wealth and cleanliness, while their true state of health was buried beneath a gleaming smile. Royalty didn't have modern plumbing, and their idea of bathroom etiquette was far more disgusting than most could imagine. Kings and queens used chamber pots, which were small containers used for urine and waste. Once used, these pots would be tossed out of windows or onto the streets, creating a filthy trail of human waste that spread disease and rot throughout their grand estates. King Louis XVI of France, despite living in one of the grandest palaces in Europe, had his chamber pots emptied by servants. And what they discarded wasn't buried or carefully disposed of. It was simply thrown out onto the streets of Paris. The streets became littered with filth, and the stench of urine, feces, and decaying waste wafted through the royal city, creating a health hazard not just for the commoners, but for the royalty as well. It wasn't just a matter of bad hygiene. It was a public health nightmare. The grand palaces of these royals, despite their opulence, were cesspools of disease. With no proper waste disposal, human waste would collect on floors, seeping into the walls, and creating a breeding ground for bacteria, insects, and vermin. Royalty might have lived in luxury, but they were surrounded by a hidden world of filth. The grandeur of their courts and rooms couldn't hide the reality that they were, quite literally, sitting in their own waste. This lack of proper hygiene wasn't just a royal flaw. It was a deadly flaw that contributed to the spread of disease among the elite. Queen Victoria, despite her immense power and influence, was notorious for her lack of personal hygiene, especially when it came to something as basic as changing her undergarments. She reportedly rarely changed her clothes, including her underwear, which she would wear for days, sometimes weeks, without washing. In fact, it was said that the Queen's undergarments were often left soiled and grimy, as she was far more focused on maintaining the illusion of elegance than on the practicality of cleanliness. This filthy habit wasn't an isolated trait of Queen Victoria. It was actually quite common among the royalty of the era. Many members of the royal court, including Queen Victoria, were unconcerned with personal cleanliness, believing that their elevated status gave them freedom from such mundane matters. To mask the overwhelming stench of her unwashed body and clothes, Queen Victoria resorted to using excessive amounts of perfume. But this only exacerbated the problem, as the strong fragrances mixed with the odors of sweat, unwashed linen, and the lingering scent of dirty body odor, creating a nauseating blend that would waft throughout her court. The obsession with elegance and appearance meant that cleanliness was often secondary, if not completely ignored. The royal court, in all its grandeur, was a hotbed of pests, including lice and fleas, which thrived in the unwashed fabrics and the stale air of the palace. Despite the luxurious surroundings, the constant infestations of lice, along with the damp, stale conditions, left many of the royals with a nasty combination of body odor and filthy clothing. It was an air of beauty and power on the outside, but beneath the royal gowns, the truth was far more disgusting and unsanitary. Royals, lacking proper hygiene, turned to heavily scented oils and perfumed sachets as their only means of masking the overpowering stench of their unwashed bodies. In the absence of baths and cleanliness, the royal courts became saturated with fragrances, each hallway and room thick with the smell of strong perfumes. The aim was clear: to cover the foul smells of decay, body odor, and the diseases that ran rampant through the palace walls. But instead of actually addressing their personal hygiene, many royals relied on these overpowering scents, thinking they could conceal the filth beneath the surface. Some royals took it even further, rubbing perfume directly onto their bodies, allowing it to soak into their dirty skin in the hope that it would camouflage the stench of sweat and dirt. The idea was simple: smell good, feel powerful, even if the reality was far more disgusting. Royals would wear the most elaborate fragrances, choosing scents so intense that they could cover up nearly any unpleasant odor. The stench of decay and decaying bodies was thus hidden behind a sickly, sweet cloud, a false sense of cleanliness that made the royals feel clean, when in reality they were living in filth. This obsession with fragrance masked the unimaginable filth in ways that modern people cannot fathom. What we now associate with luxury and beauty was actually a method of hiding what was truly beneath bodies that were not just dirty, but often covered in disease and decay, parading in gilded robes and jewels, all while the real state of their hygiene was hidden by a veil of overwhelming scents. Royal bedding was rarely cleaned, and the conditions they slept in were far from the luxurious standards most would expect. In fact, royal sheets were changed only a handful of times a year, with the heavy linens left to absorb sweat, oils, and dirt over time. At the palace of King Louis XVI, the sheets were often left soiled, and mattresses became infested with lice, bed bugs, and other pests. Despite the grandeur of his court, the king slept on sweat-soaked sheets, surrounded by a world of uncleanliness. This was not just a royal problem, it was a widespread issue. Royals, who were meant to embody cleanliness and elegance, were often resting in their own filth. Their beds, instead of being sanctuaries of rest, were breeding grounds for lice and bugs. The mattresses themselves were rarely aired out, and the bedding was rarely washed, leaving a smell of decay that lingered in their chambers. But, for the royals, this was an accepted part of their daily life, something that simply came with the privilege of ruling. Hygiene, in their eyes, was a luxury of the lower classes. Despite the luxury of golden furniture, jewels, and silks, the very place they laid their heads at night was far from clean. The stench of decay, combined with the constant presence of vermin, was a grim reality in these palaces. Yet, for the royals, it was nothing more than background to their decadent lives. Queen Mary I of England, like many other royals of her time, had a disturbing disregard for cleanliness. She reportedly threw food scraps directly onto the floor of her chambers for her pet pigs to eat. This was not an isolated incident. Royals were known to allow their animals to roam freely through their palaces, with little regard for hygiene. Instead of properly disposing of food waste, or even cleaning up after themselves, they simply fed it to their pigs, turning their chambers into filthy, disease-ridden environments. These royal pigs, as bizarre as it sounds, were often the scavengers of leftover food, scraps, and waste. The problem wasn't just that they were allowed to roam freely. It was that waste was left to accumulate, creating perfect conditions for the spread of disease. Pigs, notorious for eating anything they could find, became a breeding ground for parasites and bacteria. As they rooted around in the waste, filled royal chambers, they carried and spread diseases, affecting both the royal family and their servants. The lack of waste disposal not only contributed to the unsanitary conditions of the royal courts, but also fueled the spread of illnesses that could have easily been prevented. In the midst of palaces filled with luxury, royals continued to live in filth, allowing their beloved pets to feast on leftover food and spreading disease right alongside their decadence. Royalty, though shielded by their wealth, lived in squalor. Their refusal to practice basic hygiene was a symbol of their absolute power and unimaginable privilege, showing how deeply entitlement can corrupt. These unsanitary practices became cultural norms within royal courts, spreading through the ranks of the elite, with kings and queens oblivious to the filth they surrounded themselves with. In a world of gold and marble, these royals were sickeningly dirty underneath. Despite their grandeur, the royals were just as dirty as the common folk, if not worse, proving that even the most powerful rulers can become trapped in their own filth. History is dark, and we must remember it.